While the Pima County Sheriff's Office in Tucson has been in the national spotlight for its ongoing search for the missing Nancy Guthrie, an unexpected twist has surfaced from within the department itself. The sheriff leading the high-profile search effort has now come under scrutiny after discrepancies were discovered in his own past work history. Notably, the issue isn't connected to the investigation into the disappearance that has captured public attention. Instead, it revolves around something far more personal, a misleading claim about his own background. The revelation has quickly sparked new questions. Why would the top law enforcement official misrepresent part of his own career, and what might be behind that decision? As the search continues, this surprising detail adds yet another layer of intrigue to an already closely watched story. For more than 40 years, a part of his past remained hidden. Newly uncovered records show that the sheriff leading the search for Nancy Guthrie was once forced out of a previous police department under troubling circumstances. The information, revealed by the Arizona Republic, raises serious questions about his actions since the investigation began. When reporters asked him about it, he didn't deny the claim or offer an explanation. Instead, he responded with just 6 words. And once you hear those 6 words, it may become clear why some believe this case could be in serious trouble. But before examining what the newspaper uncovered, let's briefly look at where the case stands now. It has been 41 days. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson during the early hours of February 1st. Bloodstains found on her porch were later confirmed to be hers. Her doorbell camera had been physically removed, and the monitoring app connected to her pacemaker suddenly went offline at exactly 2:28 a.m. Surveillance footage captured a masked man carrying a backpack from Walmart, moving through the area in the dark. Since then, investigators have reviewed thousands of hours of video and processed tens of thousands of tips. The family has offered a $1 million reward, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation has added another $100,000. Yet after more than a month, no one has been charged, no suspect has been publicly identified, and no arrest appears imminent. Meanwhile, the man leading the local investigation, Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Office, told NBC News just days ago that investigators are definitely closer. It's the same line he has repeated since the second week of the case. No timeline, no new details, just the assurance that they are getting closer. With that background in mind, here's the development that changed how many people are now looking at this investigation. This week, the Arizona Republic published a report based not on rumors or speculation, but on official records. These were documented files, verified paperwork that paints a very different picture of the past of Chris Nanos, the sheriff of Pima County Sheriff's Office. According to those documents, the man who has appeared repeatedly on NBC News, Fox News, and the Today Show as the public voice of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie was once forced to resign from a previous law enforcement position. Not a quiet retirement. Not a routine career move. He was pushed out under circumstances that, remarkably, he has never publicly revealed throughout his entire career. For more than 40 years, that chapter of his past remained buried. On the surface, Nanos' career appeared typical of a veteran law enforcement officer. Years spent working in Tucson, steadily climbing the ranks before eventually running for sheriff in Pima County and winning. From there, he became the public face of a department responsible for policing more than 9,000 square miles of desert across southern Arizona. But the newly uncovered records suggest that the story behind that career may be far more complicated than it once seemed. When the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie turned into one of the most closely watched kidnapping cases in the country, Chris Nanos quickly became the public face of the response, appearing on networks like NBC News and Fox News. His resume presents a familiar story: years in law enforcement, including time with the El Paso Police Department in El Paso, before eventually building his career in Tucson and rising to lead the Pima County Sheriff's Office. But according to documents obtained by the Arizona Republic, the way his time in El Paso ended was never fully disclosed. The records indicate that Nanos did not simply leave the department voluntarily. Instead, he resigned in lieu of termination, a formal phrase often used in law enforcement when an officer is given the option to step down before being officially fired. In other words, he walked away just before the department could permanently attach the word "terminated" to his record. In policing, where internal documentation is meticulous, That phrase carries far more weight than it might appear at first glance. In law enforcement agencies, nothing simply disappears. Every complaint, disciplinary review, suspension, or use of force incident generates official paperwork, reviewed through internal affairs and formal oversight processes. Reaching the point where a department considers termination means those internal records have already crossed a serious threshold. That's where the phrase, resigned in lieu of termination, comes in. Within police departments, it's often a strategic decision by the institution. The officer leaves quietly while the department avoids a lengthy, contested firing process. The officer walks away, but the documentation remains in the file, usually unseen by the public unless someone goes digging through records. According to documents obtained by the Arizona Republic, that is exactly what happened with Chris Nanos during his time at the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. The records show his departure year as 1982. Yet his own resume lists 1984. 2 missing years, unexplained, and for more than 4 decades of his career in Arizona law enforcement and politics, no one publicly addressed the discrepancy. Which raises the next question: what exactly was inside that disciplinary file? What the records reveal is not a single mistake or an isolated lapse in judgment. Instead, they suggest a pattern, something often far more telling than any carefully crafted biography. Documents obtained by the Arizona Republic describe multiple disciplinary incidents during Chris Nanos' time with the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. Among the issues cited was insubordination, refusing to follow orders from superior officers. In a police department, where the chain of command is fundamental to how the organization operates, that kind of violation is taken seriously because it directly challenges the structure the entire system relies on. The records also mention excessive force. That detail carries weight for 2 reasons. On one level, it raises questions about how Nanos conducted himself while working in the field. On another, it speaks to a broader issue of accountability. When an officer is formally disciplined for excessive force, it means the department has officially determined that the way authority was exercised crossed a line and needed to change. The disciplinary file outlined more than just 1 or 2 problems. According to records obtained by the Arizona Republic, several separate incidents were documented during Chris Nanos' time at the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. One entry notes a firearm discharge recorded as its own infraction, separate from the excessive force finding. Another cites off-duty gambling, conduct outside the job that the department still considered serious enough to formally discipline. The records also reference repeated tardiness, significant enough to be logged in official documentation. But perhaps the most revealing line in the file isn't tied to a single event at all. It describes what investigators called consistent inefficiency. That wording suggests something broader than a momentary mistake. It points to a pattern observed over time, across multiple reviews and situations, serious enough that someone inside the department decided it needed to be formally recorded. Among the incidents listed in the records, one appears to have been the turning point. According to documents reviewed by the Arizona Republic, Chris Nanos was once suspended for 15 days without pay while serving with the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. The suspension followed an arrest in which a robbery suspect was allegedly injured. A penalty of 2 weeks without salary is far from minor. It signals a serious disciplinary response rather than a routine warning or internal note. The situation escalated even further when the incident was reviewed by a grand jury. After examining the circumstances, the grand jury ultimately declined to indict, meaning Nanos was never criminally charged. Still, the fact that the case reached that level of scrutiny is notable. It shows the matter was serious enough to be considered for possible criminal accountability. When placed alongside the other documented issues, insubordination, excessive force findings, off-duty conduct, repeated tardiness, and the record of consistent inefficiency, it adds another piece to a pattern that had already been forming. Taken together, the records paint a picture of a department gradually building a case to separate from one of its officers. According to documents obtained by the Arizona Republic, Chris Nanos accumulated a total of 41 days of suspension without pay during his time with the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. Eventually, in 1982, that relationship ended with his resignation. Yet his own resume later listed his departure as 1984, a 2-year discrepancy that quietly remained in the background for decades. Through his entire career in Tucson law enforcement, through campaigns, elections, interviews, and public appearances, that gap went largely unnoticed. No one publicly revisited the records from El Paso or pressed for an explanation about why the final chapter of his time there ended the way it did, despite the fact that he would go on to build his reputation around a career in law enforcement and eventually lead the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Reporting from Newsweek indicates that Chris Nanos began working as a corrections officer for the Pima County Sheriff's Office in 1984. The same year his resume claims he left the El Paso Police Department in El Paso. But official records suggest he actually resigned 2 years earlier, in 1982. That discrepancy may seem small on paper, yet it raises a larger question. The man whose resume appears to contain an unexplained gap is the same official publicly assuring the nation that investigators are definitely closer to solving the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. When the Arizona Republic approached Nanos with the documents and offered him a chance to explain the 40-year-old inconsistency, he had several options. He could have acknowledged the records, provided context, or admitted past mistakes. Instead, his reply took a different tone. In a written response to the newspaper, he mocked the inquiry, joking about reporters going back to his high school and calling the investigation a hit piece. The reaction stood in sharp contrast to the seriousness of the question, which was based not on rumors or speculation but on official employment records that appear to contradict the timeline on his own resume. At the center of all this is Chris Nanos, the sheriff who has been standing in front of cameras as the public face of the search for Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old woman taken from her home in Tucson in the middle of the night. Yet when reporters from the Arizona Republic asked him a direct question about verified records from his own professional past, his response was to dismiss the inquiry as a hit piece and move on. But the story didn't stop there. After the newspaper published its findings, the Pima County Sheriff's Office issued an official statement. Notably, they didn't dispute the documents or challenge the reporting. Instead, the department explained that the incorrect dates on the sheriff's resume were the result of what they described as 2 clerical errors. The response avoided denying the records themselves, but it opened a new round of questions about how such discrepancies could remain unnoticed for decades. The explanation offered was simple: 2 clerical errors. According to the statement from the Pima County Sheriff's Office, the resume of Chris Nanos mistakenly listed his departure from the El Paso Police Department in El Paso as 1984. Official records, however, show the separation occurred in 1982, a difference of 2 full years. Not a swapped digit or formatting slip, but a gap that covers an entirely different period of time. After the findings were published by the Arizona Republic, the department quietly updated the resume. In the process, they acknowledged another discrepancy as well. Nanos' promotion to captain had been listed as 2009, while the correct year was 2007. Both dates were corrected and attributed to administrative mistakes. The revisions were made with little fanfare, framed simply as clerical issues, but the corrections themselves raised broader questions about how such inaccuracies remained unaddressed for decades. What makes this detail significant isn't just the resume discrepancy. It's the way the situation was handled. When documents surfaced that contradicted the official timeline, the response from the Pima County Sheriff's Office wasn't a detailed explanation or a transparent acknowledgement. Instead, the issue was described as a simple clerical mistake, followed by a quiet correction to the record. For those closely following the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, that response may feel familiar. It reflects a broader pattern critics say has appeared at different moments during the investigation itself. Questions raised, answers kept brief, and details adjusted after the fact. And when you consider that Chris Nanos has been the person at the top of the decision-making chain, each of those moments can start to look different in hindsight. If you've been following this case from the beginning, some of the issues ahead may sound familiar, but the context behind them adds a new layer. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. The goal is simple: to examine every development in this case with verified sources and clear context, without speculation, so you can see the full picture as it unfolds. There's another moment involving Chris Nanos that takes on a very different tone when viewed in light of the records uncovered by the Arizona Republic. During a press conference on February 3, 2026, early in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, Nanos made a remark that at the time sounded almost casual. standing before cameras as national attention grew. He said he wasn't used to everyone hanging on my words and trying to hold me accountable. In the moment, many could interpret that as a simple acknowledgement of the pressure that comes with intense media scrutiny. After all, the case had quickly drawn widespread attention, with millions watching each update and hoping for answers about the 84-year-old woman taken from her home in Tucson. But that comment feels different when revisited now, after the El Paso records, after the resumed discrepancy between 1982 and 1984, and after the department's explanation of clerical errors. In that new context, a line that once sounded like an awkward aside now raises a deeper question about accountability at the very top of the investigation. In hindsight, the remark from Chris Nanos about not being used to being held accountable feels less like a passing comment and more like a reflection of a long-standing pattern. Critics argue that throughout his career, from the unresolved questions surrounding his time at the El Paso Police Department to the resumed discrepancy highlighted by the Arizona Republic, serious issues have rarely been confronted directly. Those concerns resurfaced early in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The morning after the 84-year-old vanished from her home in Tucson, the property became a crime scene. Inside were disturbing signs, bloodstains, a removed doorbell camera, and personal belongings left exactly where they had been when she was taken. Yet reports from several outlets indicated the perimeter was not tightly secured at first, allowing journalists to approach close enough to see blood on the porch. When questioned on February 5th, Nanos acknowledged the concern, saying he would have preserved the scene longer if given the chance to do it again. He explained that investigators believed they had already collected what they needed. But securing a crime scene is widely considered the most basic step in any investigation, before forensic analysis, before interviews, and certainly before public briefings. In any criminal investigation, the first rule is simple: secure the scene. Establish a perimeter, restrict access, and ensure that evidence remains untouched. Yet in the case of Nancy Guthrie, reports indicated that those basic safeguards were not fully in place during the early stages. The responsibility for that perimeter ultimately fell under the leadership of Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Another moment during the investigation added to the scrutiny. On the same day, members of the Guthrie family appeared publicly, speaking directly to whoever took her and pleading for answers. Nanos was reportedly attending a college basketball game. The detail was widely noted once it became public. To be fair, law enforcement officials are human. Investigators need rest, and a sheriff attending a sporting event does not automatically mean an investigation is being neglected. But perception matters. The image of the county's top law enforcement official at a game while the victim's family stood before cameras asking for help inevitably raised questions about priorities and awareness of the emotional weight this case carries for those most affected. Throughout it all, the Guthrie family has remained notably composed, choosing not to publicly attack the investigation itself. Throughout the ordeal, the family of Nancy Guthrie has remained remarkably composed. They cooperated fully with investigators and even offered a $1 million reward of their own money, all while avoiding public criticism of the investigation. But their restraint does not erase the questions surrounding how the case has been handled. In the early stages, investigators recovered DNA evidence from the crime scene and nearby areas. Later reporting revealed that some of those samples were complex, mixed profiles from multiple individuals that require advanced forensic analysis. In cases like this, the standard path often leads to the laboratory of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Quantico, known for handling the most difficult forensic evidence in the country. However, under the leadership of Chris Nanos, the evidence was instead sent to DNA Labs International, a private laboratory in Deerfield Beach, Florida. That decision drew criticism from some forensic experts who publicly questioned the choice. In a case involving the abduction of an elderly woman, unidentified suspects, and national attention, the handling of sensitive DNA evidence inevitably became another point of debate. In complex investigations, especially those involving mixed DNA samples, standard practice is to rely on the most advanced resources available. The laboratory of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Quantico is widely regarded as the primary destination for evidence in high-profile federal cases, partly because it has direct access to national systems like CODIS, the country's central DNA database. Mixed genetic profiles, which may involve material from multiple individuals, require highly specialized analysis to separate and interpret. If a potential match exists anywhere within law enforcement databases, the fastest and most direct path often runs through federal laboratory channels. Yet in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the decision from Chris Nanos and the Pima County Sheriff's Office was to send the evidence to a private lab instead, another choice that observers struggled to fully understand. Around the same period, another statement from Nanos drew attention. Early in the investigation, he publicly announced that members of the Guthrie family had been cleared as potential suspects, an assertion that raised additional questions about how quickly those determinations were made in such a complex case. Another point that drew attention was the timing of a public statement from Chris Nanos regarding the family of Nancy Guthrie. Early in the investigation, he announced that family members had been cleared as potential suspects, yet that announcement came before DNA results from the crime scene had been returned. In most criminal investigations, the sequence is critical. Investigators collect evidence, analyze it, and then allow the results to guide their conclusions. Evidence informs decisions, not the other way around. Declaring a clearance before key forensic results are available can appear premature and may raise questions about how conclusions are being reached. It's important to note that the Guthrie family has fully cooperated with authorities and was ultimately cleared by the investigation's later findings. The issue being raised is not about their involvement, but about the investigative process itself, specifically, why such a definitive statement was made before all the forensic evidence had been analyzed by the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Among the many questions surrounding the investigation, one allegation stands out because of its seriousness. Chris Nanos was accused of withholding evidence from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When asked about it by KVOA, the NBC affiliate in Tucson, Nanos firmly rejected the claim, saying it was not even close to the truth. To be clear about the public record, the accusation itself was reported by Reuters, and it was denied. There has been no confirmed evidence showing that information was actually withheld. What exists publicly is an allegation and a denial, nothing more definitive. Still, in the broader context of the investigation into Nancy Guthrie, the claim inevitably draws attention. It arrives alongside other controversial decisions already under discussion. The choice of a private DNA lab, the early clearance of family members before forensic results, and the initial security concerns around the crime scene. Even when denied, an accusation like this does not exist in isolation. It becomes part of a larger pattern that observers continue to examine closely. If these developments raise questions about the evidence, the suspect profile, or other aspects of the case, this channel explores each angle in detail with source-based reporting. Criticism of Chris Nanos during the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie hasn't come only from outside observers. It has also surfaced from within his own department. Aaron Cross, a sergeant and president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, spoke to the New York Post during the case and offered a striking critique. According to Cross, the search for Guthrie was being handled as what he described as a personal ego case. That comment carried particular weight because Cross represents deputies working under the Pima County Sheriff's Office. In other words, the criticism was not coming from political opponents or outside commentators, but from someone inside the department itself. Cross also highlighted another point of tension during the search. When the volunteer group United Cajun Navy submitted a detailed 41-page proposal offering assistance, including thermal drones, specialized search dogs, and organized desert grid operations, Nanos' official response was to decline the offer and instruct the group to stand down. That decision quickly became another debated moment in an investigation already under intense scrutiny. Aaron Cross publicly pushed back on the decision to decline outside assistance, arguing that in a search of this magnitude, more help is better than less. The contrast between his position and that of Chris Nanos, one saying bring in additional resources, the other telling volunteers like the United Cajun Navy to stand down, offered a glimpse of how the investigation has been perceived not only by outsiders, but from within the department itself. Throughout the search for Nancy Guthrie, Nanos has repeatedly stepped in front of cameras, assuring the public that investigators are getting closer and that the process is moving forward. Each briefing carries an implicit message: trust the department, trust the investigation. But reporting from the Arizona Republic introduced a question that many observers now find difficult to ignore. What is the foundation of that trust if key details of the sheriff's own professional history remained inaccurate for decades? The resume controversy itself is not the investigation. Yet it has become part of the context through which the public is now evaluating how the investigation is being conducted. As of now, Nancy Guthrie remains missing. Investigators recently confirmed they are examining a damaged utility box discovered near her home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. The box may be linked to a reported internet outage on the night of February 1st. And outage neighbors say temporarily disabled home surveillance systems during the same time window when Guthrie disappeared. On March 5th, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Pima County Sheriff's Office canvassed the neighborhood with two very specific questions. First, did residents experience internet disruptions that night? Second, and far less discussed, did anyone have security footage from January 11th, nearly 3 weeks before the disappearance? Investigators have not publicly explained why that earlier date matters. But the request itself suggests they may be looking at something that occurred weeks before the abduction. Possibly surveillance of the neighborhood, reconnaissance, or movement by a suspect preparing for what would happen on February 1st. A resident of the Catalina foothills, identified as Aldine, shared a detail that has drawn growing attention. Speaking on the YouTube channel of Brian Enton, she recalled seeing a man near the home of Nancy Guthrie weeks before the disappearance. According to her description, the man immediately stood out, wearing casual street clothes, hunched over, a hat pulled low, slowly walking the road while looking closely at nearby properties, particularly Guthrie's house. In a quiet neighborhood like the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, unfamiliar faces are often noticed quickly. Aldine said the sighting happened shortly after her birthday on January 8th, placing it around January 11th, the same date investigators later asked residents about when canvassing the area. If the timing of that sighting is accurate, it supports a theory many investigators have considered, that the abduction was not random. Whoever took Guthrie appeared prepared, possibly familiar with the neighborhood, aware of security systems, and deliberate in their actions. The doorbell camera was removed, surveillance systems were reportedly disrupted, and the timing, early Sunday morning, may have provided a long window before anyone realized she was gone. The search for Nancy Guthrie continues, but progress has been difficult. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the flow of tips to their hotline has slowed after the initial surge of calls. The financial incentive remains significant: a $100,000 federal reward, the family's $1 million offer, and additional funds from Tucson Crime Stoppers, bringing the total reward to well over $1 million. Yet so far, none of the information received has led to an arrest. Several investigative leads have also reached dead ends. Mixed DNA recovered from the crime scene has not produced a usable match in CODIS, the National Law Enforcement Database. Gloves found about 2 meters away were traced to a restaurant employee who had no connection to the case. A vehicle captured on a Ring video doorbell camera around 2:36 a.m. remains unidentified despite reviews of hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Other clues have been equally elusive. A firearm holster described by experts as an uncommon universal fit design has not pointed to a suspect, and a backpack from Walmart seen in the footage has not been traced to a buyer. The investigation remains active, with agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation continuing their work from Phoenix. But as the weeks pass without resolution, the challenge only grows more difficult. As the search for Nancy Guthrie continues without resolution, attention has increasingly shifted toward how the investigation itself was handled, especially in the earliest hours. In cases involving abduction, the first 72 hours are widely considered the most critical. That window holds the freshest surveillance footage, the clearest witness memories, and the most recoverable biological and physical evidence before time, weather, and public exposure begin to degrade it. How investigators manage those initial days often shapes everything that follows. Once opportunities from that period are lost, they cannot truly be recreated, only worked around. That reality has placed added scrutiny on the leadership of Chris Nanos and the Pima County Sheriff's Office as the case moves deeper into uncertainty. At the same time, the department has been facing challenges from other directions. Earlier this month, an inmate at Pima County Jail filed a federal lawsuit naming Nanos and the department. The lawsuit is not directly tied to the Guthrie investigation, but it adds to a broader picture of a sheriff's office dealing with questions from multiple fronts: criticism from within the department, scrutiny from the press, and legal pressure in the courts. Leadership during difficult circumstances is always complex. But when concerns arise about past employment records, public responses to scrutiny, and accountability itself, those issues inevitably become part of the public conversation surrounding the investigation. Trust in a case like this cannot simply be assumed, it has to be earned. To be clear, no one is accusing Chris Nanos of being responsible for the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Nor is anyone claiming that his past service with the El Paso Police Department automatically disqualifies him from leadership. This investigation involves federal agents, forensic experts, and detectives whose work continues behind the scenes, and it's entirely possible they are closer to answers than the public currently realizes. But one fact remains difficult to ignore. The sheriff overseeing the local side of this case carried an inaccurate timeline on his resume for decades, one that did not match official records about when he left his previous department. That discrepancy came to light only after documents were uncovered by the Arizona Republic, not through voluntary disclosure. When confronted, the response was dismissive, and the later explanation from the Pima County Sheriff's Office attributed the 2-year gap to clerical errors. Meanwhile, the reality at the center of this story remains urgent. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility who depends on daily medication, has now been missing for 41 days. While the search for Nancy Guthrie continues, her family has remained in Arizona, putting their normal lives on hold as they wait for answers. Her daughter briefly returned to her job in New York City, just long enough to embrace colleagues, before heading back, because the search and the hope for answers is still centered in Tucson. Meanwhile, a question has quietly grown around the investigation. One many observers have been asking but few officials have addressed publicly. After a series of controversial moments during the case, and following reporting from the Arizona Republic about the past of Chris Nanos, some are wondering whether he is the right person to lead the local side of this investigation. Those questions touch on several issues that have surfaced during the case. The early handling of the crime scene, decisions about forensic testing, public statements made early in the investigation, and other moments that have drawn scrutiny. Whether anyone within Pima County Sheriff's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or state leadership is asking those questions privately remains unclear. For the Guthrie family, the focus has stayed on finding answers rather than criticizing investigators. But as time passes without an arrest, each unresolved detail, every piece of evidence questioned, every decision debated, adds another layer of pressure to a case that the public continues to watch closely. Looking back at the 41 days since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, every development has been closely watched. Each press conference, every tip-line update, and every assurance that investigators are getting closer. Along the way, other issues have surfaced as well, including resume discrepancies and sharp responses to questions raised by reporting from the Arizona Republic. For some observers, those moments have shifted attention toward the leadership of Chris Nanos and how the investigation has been managed at the top. Through all of it, Guthrie's family has remained notably composed. Rather than publicly attacking the investigation, they have focused on cooperation, offering resources, announcing rewards, and keeping attention on the search. Their efforts have kept the case visible while investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation continue working behind the scenes. The central question remains unanswered: who took Nancy Guthrie and why? As discussions continue and new information emerges, the case still demands careful scrutiny, because for the family and for the public, the goal remains the same: finding the truth and bringing resolution to a disappearance that has gripped the country. There are still many angles surrounding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie that demand careful examination: the reported internet blackout, the possible suspect profile, forensic questions around the ransom note, the unexplained interest in January 11th footage, and even theories involving a potential Wi-Fi disruption. But before exploring those leads in detail, another issue had to be addressed first: the foundation of the investigation itself, including the background of the person leading it, Chris Nanos. Reporting from the Arizona Republic about records from the El Paso Police Department introduced details many viewers had never heard before: disciplinary files, a resignation under pressure, and a resume timeline that did not match official records. For many observers, understanding that context is essential before evaluating the rest of the case. If those revelations were new to you, sharing the information helps keep attention on the search for answers. Public discussion, when grounded in verified reporting, can ensure that the right questions continue to be asked. The next step is examining the evidence itself, the surveillance gaps, the technical possibilities behind the outage, and what a realistic investigative path forward might look like. Because at the center of all of this remains one urgent fact: Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and her family is still waiting for the truth.